Hello and welcome, everybody. My name is Scott. I am the host of Optional Rule, a weekly discussion show for all things tabletop role playing game related and Dungeons and Dragons. Thank you and welcome. If you're joining me for the first time, if you're catching this later, I hope you'll give it a like, subscribe, social media things, follow me on Twitch, follow me on YouTube. Also, follow me on Twitter. That's where most of the live discussion happens during the week. So I'm hoping that you'll enjoy the content I create. It's mostly theory crafting around D&D and tabletop role-playing games in general, mostly from a DM's point of view, but there's a lot to learn from everybody, from players to DM. So, L'chaim. This week I am running a little behind, but I am going to discuss today a little bit about designing tragic encounters and to the extent that I'm going to do a post-mortem for some games that I've had previously. Hold on, I'm going to adjust my light here 1 second. That probably makes me washed out, but that's fine. From a perspective of a post-mortem for a game where I included a good bit of sort of tragic storyline that the players engaged with in a weird way that was a lesson for me as a DM. I want to share that lesson with you and create the potential of a blog post. So really, these are two blog posts that are upcoming and preparation for my upcoming weekly Rhyme of the Frost Maiden session that will include some mounted combat there. That's why I'm going to get into the mounted combat design. But I hope you'll join me every week. I do a weekly stream and I do some ad hoc streams during the regular week as well, just to talk about maybe some game streaming. I'm probably going to do some Baldur's Gate 3 streaming a little bit later today or tomorrow. They just released the Druid subclass, but primarily this is a discussion show. So I hope you'll leave your comments down about your observations, your experiences, and what works for you in gaming. And that's what this is really about. It's just what works for you. So let's just jump into it. Let's talk about tragedy. I have my mounted combat rules here. We'll get to that in a minute. But I'm going to create, by the way, this is my blog and content ideas. I'm just going to add a page called Tragic Game Storylines. Let me call it Storylines. Lines in RPGs. So why do I want to talk about this today? So I'm going to give sort of a post-mortem for a game that I ran a few times where I ran tragic storylines that either worked or fell flat, and what we can learn about that. So one of the first things I want to pull up is I want to see, actually, can I find Hamlet's hit points beats? I don't know if there's a work or not. Hamlet hit points beats. Hamlet's hit points game right. This is a great book by Robin D. Laws. I highly recommend it. I'm just trying to see if there's a list of narrative beats. Let me try narrative beats because it might help with this discussion. Anyway, I suggest taking a look at this book. It breaks down the story and narrative structure by 3 different narratives. I think there's Hamlet, the play Hamlet, and 2 others that it keeps going back and forth to talk about how to do scene and encounter construction in a tabletop role-playing game perspective. So it breaks it down to the type of beat, whether it's a pipeline for information, whether it's a setup, whether it's a combat, there's different types of narrative beats that make it very, when you design your encounter, you're very cognitive of what you're trying to do with that encounter. Anybody who's joined me in any previous stream is going to know that I'm really big on this concept of what do you want out of this encounter? Like, what is it you're trying to achieve? That's the fundamental question I always ask myself when I do this. So this helps you with that design level of thinking as a game master when you're trying to establish something. And specifically, tragic stories are difficult to tell because you're conveying emotions, the players. The difference between a short story or a movie and a role-playing game is that in role-playing games, it's an active form of media. Players need agency. They need something to grab onto to be able to connect to a narrative in a role-playing game. Otherwise, it's just something happening in the background and they might shrug and move off. Particularly with tragedy, tragedy can overwhelm players in a way that they're not ready to hear that particular plot point. We talk about session zero and triggering events. That's obviously a concern, but that's out of the scope of the conversation I'm going to have today. I want to talk about how you can express tragic events like an encounter or a narrative or a segment of a campaign that's centered on a tragic event in a way that engages players. That's what I'm going to focus on today. So, postmortem. Let me break down something that happened that didn't work. Let me break down something that happened that did work when I expressed tragedy in previous games. So let me start with the didn't work part. I ran, must be 2 years ago now, I was running an Eberron, 5th edition Eberron game. The storyline I had in mind, and this is always something you want to check. Sometimes as a game master, you like the idea of something, but that's not something that plays out that way to the players. So I had this storyline in mind where changelings are a part of the Eberron world. They're basically mini doppelgangers. They're a player race. They can change their appearance at will. And they typically culturally form different identities over time, either to hide or just that's part of their culture. And so I wanted to, this has lots of implications as it relates to spy craft and intrigue and trust within a society if someone isn't. And there's a bunch of social metaphors for that, but I'm not going to get into that right now. But the end result is I wanted a plot. The players had something called the Cabinet of Faces, which is sort of a cabal of changelings trying to manage, control the world behind the scenes. And they were having a war with the Lords of Dust in the city called Batharond in the world, which I had done all the background for. So it's on the edge of the Mournlands, which is this sort of tragic place, a kingdom that was destroyed in a great magical event. And the plot line was supposed to be that the players get there, they encounter something sinister happening to changelings in that city, and that is that they are lost in sort of kind of an analog to Alzheimer's, where the changelings, especially older ones, if they shifted their form, they would adopt the memories, the vague memories of this new personality, and lose the memories of their previous life. So they would be confused, they would forget who they are. It was kind of tragic. And what the intent was here, this was being caused to happen by the Lords of Dust. The players would uncover this plot line of the Lords of Dust and undo it and save the changelings. That was the ultimate plot line. But what happened instead was the players first encountered these some changelings in the midst of this frightful behavior, and they immediately checked out. It was just too tragic. It was too overwhelming. And the lesson there was don't overwhelm the players, first of all. And I'll tell you why that happened in it, and some techniques you can use to avoid that in the future. And the other one was it didn't present them with any agency. It just happened as a background world event, and it wasn't immediately apparent to them that they had the ability to affect this or why. So agency and insulation are the two things that that I want to express. So I'm going to try to create a blog post about this. I'm going to take some notes for myself. I'm not going to write the blog post here, but downside. So I'm going to go postmortem was that I presented this in a way that was all set up and no resolution. In other words, the way I set the scenario up is the players exited what was called a lightning rail, a train service. By the way, thank you for joining me here. To go ahead and drop a hello down in chat if you want. If you have any observations, please share them during this. I'm happy to read it out and discuss it on air. Or leave them in the comments. I'll comment later if you're seeing this later as a recorded show. So anyway, what had happened was they arrived at a train station, got off the train. It was a very sort of American immigrant type of experience with lots of refugees coming back and forth. So it was already set up as a tragic experience, but they ran across a changeling family sort of huddled together trying to get out of town, being harassed by the guards. One of the members of the family shifted uncontrollably, and shifting was declared illegal in the town. So the guards began to harass them right away. Hey, no shifting! And the person who shifted began to act confused because they had lost their memory of who they were because it was involuntary, and it caused this whole incident on the platform. And it had the players were observers to this. They listened to me express this because I expressed it from the first person role playing perspective of the family. So I would talk in the voice of the confused elderly elderly changeling about, I don't understand what's happening. I would talk in the first person voice of the guards harassing them. I would talk in the first person concern voice of the family. So this was my first sin as a dungeon master. I presented the players with a tragic situation from the point of view of the different players in it. So it made it too personal. It made it much too biting. It made it much too too direct. Right? There wasn't a layer removed to remind them, hey, this is a narrative, and it's not just something you're watching on the news. So the solution to that, I'll set up a no resolution first person. I'll write here a note here for my first person problem. Person problem. Perspective. So let me talk about that. So that created, again, no agency. What were the players supposed to do about this? The intention I had as a game master was, and I do this often with adventures. I mean, this, and most people do. You set up the situation, you reveal the plot, then you progress to sort of some action on the player's part to be able to affect it, and then you proceed to the resolution. Now, that works many times. Sometimes it doesn't work with a mystery because you have to establish why do they care about this mystery. You also have to do that with a tragedy. That's another sin I didn't do. Why do they care? I'm going to take a note for myself here. Why do they care? But with a tragedy, players, real life, you have to sit with all kinds of tragic things, but that's not a game, right? In a game, you want to be proactive. You want to do something about it. So when you present a player with a tragic situation, what are they supposed to do with that? Like, are they, the player themselves may not have the emotional maturity to manage through that sense of tragedy. And an analog to something like Alzheimer's is a pretty heavy topic. So is war, so is famine, so is any kind of mass killing, so is anything that might border on the edge or even overlap into this triggering area, because you never know what someone's personal experiences are, right? Those are difficult. You want to present. So I think my sin there was to not present players, one, with a why should they care, and two, what they can do about it. Those are the two sort of, when you start with a negative storyline, I think, or something you need to draw them into. You need to hook them into it. Why do I care? That's what the hook is. So and then you need to get them into what can I do about it. That's really the combination of a good hook. Why do I care? What can I do about it? And it can be implied in softer stories like getting a treasure, going into a lost tomb. There's sort of an implication of why do I care? Is there's treasure in there? I can get rich. And what can I do about it? Is I can go there and look at it. So it's those types of narratives in games, those setups for encounters or sessions or one shots or whatever. It's already apparent what those two things are. But in mysteries and tragedies, it is not. So again, my failure as a DM was to just set up this tragic scenario and not give them an establishment of why. So what can you do about it? Let me take a little thing. What can you do about it? So instead of the first-person perspective, instead of the setup, agency, action, and resolution. So that's I would call that. That's a typical structure of most games, right? Setup, agency, what can they do about it? So set up the problem, give them the agency, action, so to do something about it, and resolution. That's the typical setup of an adventure. I think you need to start with cause, right? Instead of setup. There's a difference between cause and setup. When you introduce a plot line with a cause, in other words, this is artificial. Something is making this happen. That automatically gives players a sense of agency of like, well, I can do something about that. You're not asking a player to just sit with the discomfort of a mentally confused person or a tragic family event. You're saying, oh, there's something happening to cause someone to be confused or cause somebody to experience a family tragedy. That's a fundamental shift because it tells the players, tells the players they can do something about it, but it actually gives them the choice. Do I want to do something about this? Do I care enough to do something about this? So they can create their own hook if that is the case, or you can provide an additional hook. Someone can pay them to do it, or they can imply they can talk to somebody to uncover more hook, but it gives them something to bite into rather than just something to look at story-wise. So what can you do? Start with, so set up and cause, start with cause is one technique. Start with a cause. I.e. players can do something about it. And I'll go back to my example here in a moment about it. So had I instead, in this post-mortem, set up that the players want to, instead of introducing the players to a family experiencing this tragedy where they can do nothing, it really doesn't provide them with information to let them know that this is anything but a natural occurrence. I could have had them uncover a crystal that was being shipped to changing, like some manifest that these crystals were being sold to changeling families, and the crystals had both transmutation magic and it was a psi crystal, so it affected the mind. With that alone, that would have been a little bit soft, but with that alone, I could have said, then they encounter the families this was shipped to, and they realize, oh, this tragedy is befalling the family. So they realize, oh, there's somebody, the Lords of Dust, shipping this crystal to these families. Another thing I could have done is had them run across a mage's sanctum or a mage's laboratory where they talked about it. You know, like an active person doing it, like this was part of their conspiracy or plot. Another way I could have had it is let them get introduced to some mage or cleric who explained to them that this is happening, but this is artificial, and they're trying to find out what is happening here. So those are all examples of cause first. There is a tragedy being caused by a bad event that the players can engage with. Hey, Zombie Noodle. Hello. Are you referencing a specific tragic scenario or just a talking point? I am. So I'm actually bringing a couple of scenarios. One was I had, just to break it down again, is that I had a Eberron game set up where changelings were affected by a magical effect being caused by the Lords of Dust, which made them lock into the personality when they shifted. So they forgot their previous lives and they became confused. So that was the tragedy. They ran across a family that would it would cause them to involuntarily shift actually to previous forms they had taken, and they would only remember what vague memories they had of that form that they'd come up with the backstory. So it was an analog to Alzheimer's. And this caused the players to check out because it was just too tragic, and I didn't present them with enough agency. So that's one scenario. The other, so again, my advice is start with cause. You have to give, if you're going to present a tragic scenario to players, whether that be a refugee situation, whether that be personal horror like losing your mind, or whether that be a disease or a wartime scenario or something like that, to monolithic evil is, or monolithic situations, period. In other words, it's so large, it's larger than the characters, and it's unaffected by anything that happens in the world. Those are generally uninteresting plots because the players are seeking to engage in things. Now, you can have monolithic scenarios. They can fade, but that becomes set dressing. It becomes the situation, almost the landscape, the geography that the players are moving through during a campaign. But if you want them to engage directly with it, it can't be monolithic. There has to be something the players can do about it. And I will say that's a downside of the Eberron setting. There are multiple pillars of evil: the Lords of Dust, the Dragons of Arganessen, the Dreaming Dark, and they're all monolithic. They're all like bigger than anything, and there's several others too, but they're all bigger than the players can do anything about. And that's a rough setup. Let me show another. So I'll give you another example of a tragic scenario I set up, and I'll talk about the perspective. I talked earlier about one of my big problems with expressing this was, obviously I said I just gave them the setup and didn't give them any agency. Zombie Noodle says the changeling scenario sounds like a lot like Dark City. Yeah, that's exactly right. Dark City, The Matrix. There's a number of sort of narrative sources I drew on for that. I actually thought it was pretty good. And I actually still think it was pretty good. I think I just boned up the presentation, to be honest. And that's where I'm trying to do a post-mortem here. So again, I didn't hook the players with this idea of agency. I just gave them tragedy. because I think that's a mistake. Writers will do it. Writers will introduce a situation in a novel and let you sit with the discomfort of that. That's part of the novel experience. It's a passive narrative experience, so that's okay. Games are not. Again, games are an active experience. Players are always thinking, "What can I do about this?" And when you give them something they can't do anything about, they just shrug and they go, "I don't know," and they move off down to the tavern or they do whatever else they're going to do, and they do their own thing. So like I said, so setup is one big problem. The other is first person perspective. When I set up this scenario, I as I said, I role played from first person perspective the confused changeling, the concerned family, the harassing guards. This was all just a spiraling scenario that the players were like really uncomfortable with and they checked out. So I think this combination of lack of agency and too much emotional intensity were a big problem. So what can you do about that? I've tweeted about this before. My recommendation with tragedy is move into a third person perspective. In other words, don't say directly what the person says. Don't act the person out. Describe it one layer above it. Start talking about, well, the platform sort of gets very spun up as the guards begin to deal with this family obviously experiencing a tragedy. Talk about it in that insulated third person. Though one of the people seems very confused. They're talking as if they don't understand who they are. They seem to be very concerned talking to their family. Their family is going between the guards, trying to calm the guards down frantically while they're frantically trying to calm their family member down. The guards seem to be very concerned and don't like this changing, so they're just enacting their guard behavior. When you do that, when you express it in this way, it brings the players out one level. They understand, first of all, this is a narrative device, so they can, as players, go, okay, this is just a narrative. I don't need to worry about this personally. And it gives them some insulation. Now, I'll give you an example of a setup where that worked very well. I ran a Dragon of Icespire Peak campaign, the campaign previous to the Rhyme campaign that I'm running now. That ended up being a weird scenario where the players kept roping in the townsfolk to help them in the fight against this dragon, which is a big dragon at the end of that module. And honestly, the players would just go down and say, "You guys owe us. We're helping you," and they would guilt the town into helping them fight. So every able-bodied person in the town who could fight got out there and helped them and was slaughtered. They lost him. They lost everybody. The party got a little wounded, but all these poor commoners got slaughtered by the dragon and some other iterations of fights that the players roped them into. Now, I didn't want to. I wanted to express to the players that there was consequences for their choices, but I didn't want to dwell on the tragedy of the whole thing for lots of reasons. One, it was just a mad bet. Maybe not that play style is not a great mix for my DMing, so I just kind of wanted to get the campaign over with. But two, I don't believe in punishing the players. Actually, there's a big difference between giving the players the consequences of their choices and actions and punishing the players. Consequences are full. That's fine. That's what you should be doing as a game master. But at the point that you're at of punishing the players, something has gone seriously wrong. You probably should have had a talk with the players beforehand, which I did in this case. But so it's besides the point. So what had happened was the players had basically gotten half the town killed. The rest of the town was held up in a nearby mine as sort of a refugee situation from the dragon attack. The players had to go back to the town and break to them that the half the town was killed. So I used that third person technique. I talked about how grief moves in amongst the town as their loved ones were killed. People are holding on to one another, talking to one another. It was extremely effective technique. The players felt justifiably bad about this. They understood the impact, but it wasn't this emotional theater of me trying to make the players feel bad about it. They understood fully the scenario. They actually engaged with it. I was impressed because the players who have a different play style, who have that more sort of transactional play style with NPCs in the world, they actually grasp like, oh yeah, this was a bad choice. This is a bad tactical choice. This had an outcome. And it gave them some agency where they like, I want to make this up to you. We're going to go to the dragon's lair and kill it. And it spurred them to action. So it had the features that I think are very important. One, it gave the players a sense of agency. Two, it didn't overwhelm them emotionally with it. And three, it spurred them to action, which is always what you want. It automatically generated the hook for them. So, tragedy, how do you design it? start with a cause. Start with a cause. So let the players know that there is a thing in the world causing this to happen. The implication is, I'll write this implication. I hope you can see this, of agency, right? Now that cause can be a lot of different things. Like I said, you can, in the dragon's case, there wasn't anything to do about it. Maybe I should divide. Maybe that's worth a mention as well. So there's two different types of tragedy. There's a tragedy. There's an introduced tragedy, and there's a tragedy that's a result of an action. Those are separate things. An introduced tragedy, that's the thing you want to introduce with a cause. That's the thing you want to set up to establish agency with the player characters. A consequence, something the players have chosen to do, not everything works out, right? And when you move to a tragedy, you want to give them the emotional impact of that, but you don't want to linger. Let's say the tragedy could be the players getting captured. The tragedy could be the death of an NPC. The tragedy could be some world change where the bad guys have won, like an Empire Strikes Back scenario. You want to let them feel that beat of the tragedy, but immediately move to what can we do next? Because without that, why are you playing a role-playing game, right? Why are these heroes? Sometimes, I think once in my entire 40 year of gaming, the players boned up so bad, I gave them an out by letting them teleport out to a whole different kingdom. And then they could just hear the rumors of the tragedy that happened, that befell the kingdom they were from. And it was a good way to do it. But that's the only time I've ever not given them an out. Like, it had gotten so bad, like, okay, let's just hit the reset button and go somewhere else. So that's what I think. Tragic scenarios are very difficult to set up. They're part of role playing, but you want to be a little cautious about how you sprinkle them in. And I want to give a good example of a game that expresses tragic scenarios, in like Witcher 3. If you've ever played The Witcher 3, people want to recreate, they have a lot of bittersweet and tragic storylines. But if you look at the design of those quests, they give you they might introduce a topic, but don't present it to you in the first place. It might be a missing child. It might be a missing loved one. It might be some death in some family, but they don't present you with the whole of the tragedy at first. Then they let you go through to some discovery, and you always discover there's something you can do something about. Otherwise, it wouldn't be a video game, right? You can draw something. I don't often advocate for video games as analogies to role-playing games, but in this case, I think that structure has a lot of potential for us in the role-playing game space. So moving to agency quickly. So start with the cause, implicate agency very quickly. Make sure it's an external factor. So that's another thing. You don't want to just say, well, this is part of the culture, or this is the way things are. Don't make something so monolithic that they can't do anything about it. No monolithic causes. And then you also want to make sure you're expressing tragedy as it happens, not usually in the third person or indirectly. Express tragedy indirectly. I'll give you a first-person option to express tragedy indirectly. And same Eberron campaign, different storyline. Eberron is a very tragic setting in certain contexts. I run it as a post-war sort of people dealing with the fallout of this 100 Years War. I tend to run those storylines in Eberron. So there's a refugee situation, old veteran soldier situation where they were sort of at a home, an old noble who had basically spent their entire fortune taking care of these veterans, and their entire manor was now basically a tent city of all these homeless people. And it had once been this magnificent manor, but it was clearly sort of broken from the war, dirty from all the people being around it. The once great gardens were now tramped down, but they didn't mind at all. So this once great noble, I never said directly, this is what's happened to this person. This is how much they lost. I just talked about this once great mansion. All of the lawn seems to have been turned to mud from people walking around it. There's tents everywhere. Like I talked about filigree or architecture covered and caked in dirt. So it was this sense of loss without directly expressing it. Even the noble, they were reduced to one room in their entire house. They had sold off everything they had. So they're blank. I described lots of blank walls with shades where like shadows where art once hung, or what must have been mounted in alcoves or now empty alcoves with supplies stacked in them, or something like that. And they get to their room, and there's only this one small room that the noble, the ex noble, is now in, with some very precious belongings all kind of stacked up, where there's just these small quarters you can work. And they wanted the players to find the body of their missing child who had been missing in a battle. So they went to this little shrine they'd set up with their wife, pulled out a ring, and was going to give the players a ring. I didn't say it was from the wife. I didn't express any of the tragedy directly. I let the players infer it. So he gave them this ring that would pay for it. He kissed it once, and he seemed to be a little upset, and I just gave them that narrative. So just those sort of teasing of those tragedies was enough to say the players went, no, we'll find the kid. Don't worry about it. The players didn't know, but the kid was still alive. And we never got to that story because the game ended for the pandemic. But it's an example of don't try to stay away from direct expressions of tragedy. Don't let it be implied if you're doing it in the first person, or two, if you're doing it directly, do it in the third person. All right, so I'm going to take, that's not much notes because I have a hard time typing and talking at the same time, but those are my thoughts. I'm going to go ahead and write that as a blog post for some advice next week or the week after, and we move on from there. The other thing I want to cover today, and if you have any thoughts about tragic plot lines, go ahead and drop them down in the comments. I'd love to hear it. They're difficult to run, right? Games, you generally want to be happy, and there's nothing wrong with that. But sometimes I like a bittersweet plot. I like plugging into things. One additional thing is I would avoid tragedy as it relates to players. Let the players be the ones to tell you that they want a tragic narrative. There's really, don't attack possessions of players. Leave them as almost the game masters of their own narrative elements, whether they have a home or they have a family. Resist the urge to kidnap family members, or God forbid, kill them. Or if they have a home, don't attack the home frequently. And I'll tell you quickly why, is that it causes players to turtle up. If you give them an asset and you're constantly threatening that asset, the players stop going on adventures. They start staying in their castle. They start staying at home with their family. They start doing out of fear that something is going to happen to it once they leave, once they look away. Especially when they're like 6th level, where 6th level foes are going after them. There's no way a village or a town or even a small castle can stand up to most of those foes, right? So players will be reluctant to go out in the world and do something called turtling, which is not what you want. All right, so let's talk a little bit about mounted combat. Total no relation to tragedy. It's just the other topic I wanted, and I'll tell you why I'm going to do this. My Eberron game is coming up. I'm going to get to some of these references, and you'll see why in a second. My Eberron game, my homebrew creations. My Eberron game is coming up Thursday. The scenario there is they're running up against a Verbig hunter, a Jarl. It's a new custom NPC. That's why I'm going to my homebrew creations. That has a hunting ground on what they consider their territory. The players have entered it. This is an enhancement to the Black Cabin scenario. If you know the Rhyme of the Frost Maiden. And there are two things. It's that Onus Coldire is the name of the NPC, and this mount, a woolly rhinoceros, which I just love, is their mount. So Arcadia issue 1 from Matt Colville published some updated rules for mounted combat. Something I want to point out is mounted combat it exists in D&D. It's in Player 9. It's at Chapter 9 of the Player's Handbook. There's one small section right here about mounted combat. This is all you get with 1 feat. There's really not a whole lot that you get here. Matt Colville won in Arcadia. He didn't write it. It was Arcadia published an article on mounted combat that spiced it up a bit. That was really nice. It was a nice addition. What it basically did was it took the movement rules of mounted combat, added a few other properties where it gives mounts actions. Matt is a big advocate of something called action-oriented monsters, which I am too, which is basically because of the action economy, when you have a single big monster, having something that's somewhere between their individual actions and legendary actions spices combat up. That might be, in the case of mounts, it might be an extra kick attack, it might be a trample, it might be something like that that can happen during the player's turn. There's a couple things about it that don't. I'd already written some mounted rules, and there's a couple things that like every game master rubbed me a little bit the wrong way. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that and what we can do about it. So this is the woolly rhinoceros. I'm going to be posting this, by the way, to my blog sometime. Probably it's after I run it for the players, so I think it'll happen this Thursday, which means it'll get posted the week after. Now, what don't I like about the Arcadia rules? They're great rules, by the way. No shade. Great rules. There's a couple of things that I'm nip tucking. So I love this idea in Arcadia that mounts are given an additional action. They get too many actions, I think, in normal Arcadia rules. When you get something mounted, when something is a mount, there's only one feature called mounted. It gets like a 3 times a day action, I think a 2 times a day action, and then a reaction, which I think is that's bananas. That's a little bit too much for me, especially when I'm looking at the party's 4th level. I'm creating basically a CR5 encounter. I mean, when you're adding actions like that, you're really blowing things out of the water. So I would prefer not to get to that level. So I'm combining a CR5 Verbig with a CR3 mount. And I want to basically have them act within some sensible sense. And so you can see this Verbig has a magic item that one of the players is going to get. It's this hammer. I didn't want to do a straight up ripoff of Thor's hammer, but it's a ripoff of Thor's hammer. They can throw it and it returns to their hand. It does extra thunder damage when it hits, not lightning damage. And it can do a knockdown attack. It does thunderous smite 3 times a day. So that'd be a great weapon for the player to get. But I need to run through this combat, and so that's what got me a little dissatisfied with the combat rules from Arcadia. Like I said, too many abilities, and I don't like their prone rules, and I don't like it's a single mounted ability. So let's go to my own rules. What am I looking to do? So I always start out when I design something, what are my goals? It should be consistent with the mounted combat rules of Chapter 9, available to anyone with the proper skills. I'll just define what that is below, and then require special training on the part of the mount. One of the things I separate is there's no just one mounted feature. There's 2 separate types of mounted training for a mount, riding mount and a war mount. The main difference is that riding mounts might get scared and then might bolt, and a war mount does not. So a riding mount is trained to accept a rider and follow the directions of a trained rider. They will not willingly move towards danger. So anyone who's ridden horses, that horse is not riding towards fire. I don't care what you do. It's really questionable whether you can even get it to jump a fence. I mean, that's an advanced technique. If it can be panicked by a sudden surprise or nearby combat. In other words, the rider must make a DC 15 Wisdom Animal Handle check, or the animal will bolt. And I say bolt down here as the animal uses its reaction to immediately move its movement away from the source that caused it to bolt. And afterwards, it's frightened. It has the frightened condition towards the source. I say for 1 minute. Do I want that? Actually, design-wise, what do I want out of this? Right? I hate this. I want the players to have a choice of either staying with the mount and trying to get it under control, or dismounting and getting back into combat. So I could choose one of 2 things. Frightened condition in most cases in D&D lasts a minute. I could just say it lasts a minute. Alternatively, and usually you get a saving throw every turn. Alternatively, I could say the rider gets a check, and I think that's the way I'm going. Since typically frightened conditions on players cause you to get a save, let you get a save every turn to get back in the game, I think I'm going to give the rider a chance to continue to try to control the mount. So afterwards, it has the frightened condition towards the source, and a rider may use an action, has taken action each round round to get the animal under control. The mount, I'll call it. Mount under control. With a DC 15 animal check, animal handling check. DC 15. Wisdom. Animal handle check. Wisdom or charisma? What is handle animal? 5E skills. Let me check it out. I never can remember what skills go under. 5E skills. Is it wisdom? I think it is. Skill index. I don't think this is it, actually. This is 5E SRD. Yep, it is. Animal handling. Yeah. And I spelled that wrong. It's animal handling, not handle animal. I like that because it creates riding. It creates a differentiation between riding mounts and war mounts. And we'll get to war mounts in a second. So that's bolting, right? It bolts. It can't handle combat. It's not going to ride towards flame. And it's not going to do anything special other than ride, right? A normal movement by the mount happens as part of the rider's turn. And I'll get to that in a second. A war mount, that's a separate category. They're trained to work with the rider in combat and not easily frightened. They're not panicked by sudden surprises in combat. They will willingly move towards danger at the rider's direction. This is where I'm debating. The mount and rider's turn are considered to be happening simultaneously, not acting independently. And it typically has a trample feature as part of its stat block. So where I'm going with that is in the mount rules, and this is in Arcadia, where's my mount rules? Where's my mount rules? Combat, there we go. All right. Mounted combat, there we go. You can control the mount only if it's trained to accept the rider, domesticated, or The initiative of a controlled mount changes to match that of when you mount it. Moves as you direct it and only has 3 actions: dash, disengage, or dodge. A controlled mount can move and act even on the turn that you mount it. But it doesn't really get into mounted rider. So what I want to do is, so what's the implication of this is you get on a mount, it can move on your turn, but they're still separate turns. You can, you're moving it along. You can't attack when it's moving, right? There's at least not by the rules. So if you have multi-attack, you're kind of stuck, right? But it would be great if a war mount allowed you to use your multi-attack feature if you have it as a fighter. Otherwise, why have it from mounted? That would be great. But not as a rider, like not a riding animal probably is not great for that. But a war animal probably is. So that's a differentiation I'm trying to create. I don't know how to quite to do that. So the way I'm trying to express it is the mount and the rider's turn are considered to happen simultaneously if it is not acting independently. In other words, the mount's actions are basically an extension of the rider's actions. So if the rider, the mount moves a little bit, the rider can take an attack. If it can move a little bit more. If the rider has multi-attack, they could choose to take that multi-attack on the original character instead of using the readied action. Because other than that, what has to happen is the rider has to ready an action. I'm going to use my attack once my horse moves past an enemy, and then they execute the readied action. With multi-attack, you can't do it. You can't ready a multi-attack. You can only take one attack. This unfairly, in my opinion, hampers fighting classes who, at least thematically, should get the most benefit out of a war mount, right? Should. So that's my bugaboo with it. And maybe I'm reading too much into this. It's probably that game masters just allow it to happen, but I want to be explicit. I want to give people something to look forward to. So yeah, in lieu of it, I think that's what I'm going to do. The other thing is the prone ability. So there's some problems with the intricacies of how prone and abilities that push or knock a rider down or knock a mount down interact with the mounting rules that are in here. It doesn't specify any change to prone in the published rules. So combat itself, let me see if your mount is knocked prone, you can use your reaction to dismount as it falls and land on your feet. Otherwise, you are dismounted and fall prone in the space within 5 feet of it. Fair enough. That's actually a pretty good rule. I think and it doesn't address what happens if the rider is knocked prone. I assume they're knocked off the mount, but I don't know. Let me see. There's something about dexterity. if an effect moves your mount against its will while you're on it, you must succeed at a DC 10 dex save or fall off the mount, landing prone in the space by it. So that's another iteration. I'm going to keep that rule. Although I think, I don't know why it's a dex saving throw and not an animal handle check. I'll be honest, that's weird. Because it again, it favors rogues and not knights, which it should favor. So I think, let me add that house rule. So house rule, again, I'm being clear, this is house rules. Staying mounted. And let me just use the language they have here so it's consistent. An effect that moves your mount against its will, blah, blah, blah. All right. Let me paste that in here. Staying mounted. Boop, boop. All right. If an effect moves your mount against its will while you're on it, you must succeed on a DC. I was like 15 because you have to be trained, right? 15 wisdom, animal handling, saving throw, or fall. And actually, this is actually a pretty good case for an alternate stat. I'll say dex. Yeah, DC 15 dexterity, animals handling, saving throw, or fall off the mount, landing prone into space within 5 feet of it. If you're knocked prone while mounted, you must make the same saving throw. Yes, so the way Arcadia handles it is different. So the way Arcadia handles it, if you're knocked prone, you're knocked on the mount. You're actually not knocked off the mount. And I've been thinking about that, and I don't like it. Here's what I don't like about it. I really don't like this roll, but there's no way around it. So what I'm doing is thinking about, I hate rolls like hold up a minute rolls, right? Wait a minute, or like actually where you roll and you fail, and then you have to roll for a secondary effect to actually see if it takes effect. I don't like that because it slows down the pace of the game. You have to stop a minute. You have to introduce a new rule. It's a little weird. I think there's no way to change this staying mounted if the animal animal's moved by like thunder wave or something like that. But for you, if you're knocked prone, I think here I have these rules here. Being knocked prone dismounts the rider. A trained rider has an advantage on any roll to avoid being knocked prone while mounted. No new roll mechanic. In other words, if you get hit with earthquake or whatever that would knock you prone, knock you off the mount, you get advantage. I don't need you to roll a separate animal handling roll later and have two different rolls. I want to have it as one roll. I think it's more elegant. The other thing is, if you're knocked off a mount, it generally hurts, right? A lot of people get it. Christopher Reeves was paralyzed that way. It's dangerous. Falling off a horse is dangerous business. So when a mount is knocked prone, the rider must make a DC. Ooh, I shouldn't say that. Actually, when a rider falls off a mount, they must make. Maybe DC 15 is too high, but anyway, DC 15 dex saving throw, taking 1d6 damage on a failed save or half on a successful one. If the mount moved its full movement that turn, the rider takes an additional 1d6 damage. So in other words, if you fall off a mount moving at a full charge, you take 2d6 damage, which might kill people, normal commoners. Let me think here for a second. Do I want to do full movement or a dash? If you have an opinion, go ahead and drop it down. Should I give that extra D6 damage on a full movement, which means I have to track, it moved all but 5 of its its movement, and it gets weird? Or do I just say if it took the dash action? So if the mount took the dash action, I like that. Took the dash action. That turn, the rider takes an additional 1d6 damage. Yes, I like it. Yeah, it's basically a critical, right, at that point. All right. Actually, I shouldn't say takes an additional because that implies even if they save, they take the additional. The damage is increased by 1d6. The damage increased by 1d6. Yes. All right. So, yeah, I think that's going to be my mount rules. I'm going to change this this mount ability. I think I'm going to give riding mounts no extra abilities. War mounts have 1 to 2 extra abilities. War mounts may have up to 1 additional reaction and 1 to 2 additional limited use abilities, limited use actions. So, yeah, that's what I'm going to do. So how does that express it out in this woolly rhinoceros? So the woolly rhinoceros, this is based on the rhinoceros. This is a rhinoceros stat block. I forked it here. I'm going to increase the size so you can read it. Oh, no, did that do it? All right, here we go. Hopefully you can read that. So I think let me pull up the rhinoceros just as a comparison. Go to the top. Rhinoceros. All right. So we'll have to go back and forth, but the regular rhino has an 11 natural armor class. That's dumb, by the way. The woolly rhino is 14. The rhino is a large creature. The woolly rhino is a huge creature. I made it that big because the creature that's going to ride it is large, and mounts need to be one size larger. Normal rhinos have 45 experience. This has 7 hit points. This has 70. They have 40 movement. Same exact thing. Initiative is -1. Same exact thing. This regular rhino is a CR2. A woolly rhino is a CR3. And they have a few extra abilities. So first, rhinos have charge ability, so do woolly rhinos. Exact same damage, actually. I probably should change that, but I'm not going to. And it's a higher DC. I think you charge, they do 9 points of damage, basically 2d8. The target must succeed on a DC 15 saving throw or be knocked prone. For woolly rhino, it is DC 16. So they can just do that as part of their move, which is great. The gore is their main attack. I think the woolly rhino does 15 as its base damage plus 7 to hit, whereas a regular rhino is 14, so a little bit extra damage there. And then unstoppable charge is an extra ability I gave it. So the woolly rhino gains resistance to bludgeoning, piercing, and slashing damage. It can move through the space of any creature, large size or smaller. Remembering, it's huge. Each creature in the path of the movement must make a DC 16 dex save or take 14 bludgeoning damage and be knocked prone. So, yeah, that's pretty good. I'm trying to think, should I do large? Should I do medium or below? Or light? Large is probably fine. Yeah, large is probably fine. And I was giving him this obstinate ability, which I actually think I want to change. Oh my God, did I publish this? Oh, I didn't mean to publish it. Obstinate, I think I said when the woolly rhino takes damage, it can use its reaction to make a gore attack. Actually, that's pretty good. So I actually think that's a pretty good ability. Now, this is watered down compared to, so if I was using the standard Matt Colville rules by this, I'd give it another 2 times a day ability over that unstoppable charge. I just think that's too... I think it's too rough, you know. I will say I probably should have done it on this charge ability, right? Maybe twice a day on this charge ability instead. That would be interesting. That would make it an action, but it might make it a regular ability. And I need to give it a war-mounted ability if I'm going to lay on my own rules here. So yeah, that's what I think I'm going to do. I'm going to publish this in a few weeks. So basically... this scenario, I'm going to actually publish this as a small encounter. The encounter itself, if you joined 2 weeks ago, you would have heard when I designed this in the stream. The players have gone into a region. They're exploring something, a mystery at a cabin. In the original module, this is just basically a mystery and no combat encounters, which is not a problem. But I wanted to throw this extra weapon a player's way, and I needed some scenario to do that. So I created a scenario where there's a Verbig Jarl, which is a creature I created. I think I gave them a name here, but they have a little bit of extra hit points. They have greater armor they have half plate armor. They have a warhammer instead of a spear, and so they have a little hunting lodge here. It's very like Craster from Game of Thrones. They have a hunting lodge where they hunt creatures in the area for trophies. So the players went forward into a clearing. They found as they're approaching this area, and this is a node-based adventure, so I'll approach where that is. But they found all of these hunting trophies with little sigils on them that basically give the narrative of how this Jarl hunted and killed these creatures. So it let them know that there's a hammer involved. It let them know it's a magic. It let them know that this hunter has some animal companions that are part of it. Because one of the scenarios I have is a large eagle, trained large eagle, that's going to swoop down and grab one of the player characters and try to fly off with them. I love that. I hope the roles actually work, but players surprised by actions is something I really love. It makes them feel this heightened sense of danger. And that's an aside. So the nature of the scenario is they need to try to sneak into this cabin. The Jarl has kidnapped a person who can help the players with that black cabin scenario if they happen to have it. They've gotten the clues from it from the hunting ground, one of the hunting trophies, because they went ahead and examined it. One of the hunting trophies was just the equipment of a dwarven, what appeared to be a dwarven artificer, but there were no bones there, which means, and it was a little prisoner icon, which means they were taken prisoner. I had also established that there were other similar prisoner trophies, but there were bones there that showed that they were killed and executed at a later date. So it raises the stakes for the players so that they might want to go raise this person. When they go to this cabin, there's going to be some crafting that needs to be done, and they'll realize I need an artificer to do it, and there's an artificer captured. So it creates two hooks. One, they might want to just go get this weapon off this Verbig. Two, they might want to take them out because they're killing intelligent humanoids as well. So that hook, if the players choose to take it on. But three, if all of that fails, the players were going to go to this cabin, realize they need that artificer for something, and they'll be incentivized to go rescue them. Now, where they go from here is up to the players. They can choose to do a stealth mission. They can do a direct combat. I've already teased in that in some of the cultural knowledge that they have that they might be able to challenge this Verbig to single combat. There's lots of different things I've sprinkled in here. What will likely happen is there's a bunch of traps spread around. I've already also established that with the players. They'll have a couple animal encounters potentially as they get towards this little compound that the Verbig Jarl has, and then when they get into it, they might end up fighting with the Verbig. That might just escape and have a hunting scenario. So likely what they're going to hear at some point, they'll get discovered, trip a trap or an alarm. They'll hear a hunting horn go off, and they'll see a giant eagle circling in the sky if they can see it, because it's nighttime in Rhino the Frostmaiden. And then they know they'll be hunted. So they can choose to run. They can choose to find some place where they want to stake out as a fight with whatever tactics they want to use. They can, if they've uncovered enough information that the Verbig likes to hunt mounted, maybe they'll choose some place that the mount can't go. There's really a lot of player agency here, but it's up to the players to set that scenario up. So that's where I'm going. That's why I need these mounted rules, because I need to. The players are immediately going to see this mounted combat, and they're going to think, "Wow, that was dope. How do I get a mounted a mount?" And I need to establish some rules of how it works for them. So that's a purpose. So I'm going to polish this up. I'm going to post these on my blog sometime, probably next week, maybe the week after. So you can use them in your. But the main difference here is it establishes two tiers of mounts: riding mounts and war mounts. Establish differences there. It establishes this bolt behavior for a mount. It establishes a slightly different rules for staying mounted, which I like because I think it's more streamlined. I don't have to do a different roll later. It just lets you basically have advantage in certain scenarios. It establishes a little bit more integrated rules, allowing fighters to use multi-attack from mounted positions, which I think most people house rule anyway, but I'm just explicitly doing it. And but it fits basically with the Arcadia rules and and the mounted combat rules. I'll add a section here on some typical abilities that mounts have, like trample, charge. If they take an attack while they move by, how that might work. All of those things. I'll put in that blog post as well, just to make it actionable. It'd be really great to have knights as a viable, or mounted combat, mounted archers, or something like that. The other thing here I'll add is if how are you trained for combat? I basically should say that as a mounted combat. So let me see. I have written here somewhere. Let me just reference the bullet. A rider is I have something how you consider trained. Trying to find that line. Basically, I'm saying you're trained if you are proficient in animal handling, you have a proficiency in any land vehicle, and or you have any feat that gives you some sort of mounted feature. I wrote it here somewhere, and I don't know why it's probably staring me right in the face, but I can't find it. A rider is considered trained if they have proficiency in animal handling, has proficiency in any land vehicle, or any feat granted an effect while mounted. So so the other thing is, what about attack? So I want to disincentivize attacks from, and I'm debating this. If you have a comment, let me know what it is. But I want to disincentivize attacks by riders not trained. So if you're attacking from horseback, you're at disadvantage, basically. So untrained I'll put that as a sub bullet here. Any attack from a mount by an untrained rider is made at disadvantage. Now this is separate from a mount, a riding mount or a war mount, because already if it's, you can attack from a you're already at a disadvantage if you're attacking from a riding mount, right? It's going to be panicked by the combat, so you have to make an animal handle check to keep the thing from bolting. So I don't need, if you have disadvantage on top of that, I don't want to tie it to the mount's trained ability. I want to tie it to the rider's trained ability. So a rider who's on a war mount and is proficient with riding can attack, use multi-attack. They're not at disadvantage, and things like that. Yeah, so I like that. I like that. That's good. This also gives, there's like one notch down for mounted archers. The implication is a archer can shoot from a riding mount, because they're generally not going to enter into individual combat to panic it. Now, if the animal gets attacked, if it takes damage, it might panic. But that's a separate thing altogether. I like these rules. I think they're simple. I think they provide enough flavor. I don't want to get into this question that's going to be arisen. I'm going to wrap the show up here in a couple minutes. There's likely a question that's going to arise about extra damage and attack. It's absolutely true that in the real world, there was a damage add to any rider, because they would lean into the stirrup, and the weight and the momentum of the horse would be added to their weapon, and cavalry devastated battlefields through most of history. That's not in question. Do I need to replicate that in D&D? D&D is not a combat simulator. It's an abstraction. So I do think all of these, like the addition of movement, the ability to move in and out of combat. Remember, the mount can take the disengage action, which means it can move past foes and they don't get opportunity attacks against you. That alone, I think, is perfectly adequate for creating mounts as a viable alternative. The other thing you want to do here is you don't want to make them more powerful than a Beastmaster's Beast Companion. And I think this does that. That's one of my other bugaboos about the Arcadia rules, is it makes mounts way more powerful than Beastmaster Companions, which isn't a problem if it's an NPC, right? It isn't a problem if it's a monster stat block, because those have a challenge rating. But sooner or later, if you give some neat ability that's tied to just the way things work in the world, a player is going to want to do it. A player is going to ask, can I have a war horse? The game master should find a way to do that if they want to make a character like that. That again works well with the Beastmaster rules. So if they were a Ranger Beastmaster with a war horse, they could, there's a lot that can be done there, but it doesn't overshadow it. And I don't mind it because you have to spend. I'm going to price a warhorse at about the price of plate armor, right? So plate armor is already really expensive. It's so expensive. It's more expensive than many magic items. Um, like a medium armor or light armor that's enchanted per plus one is less expensive than plate armor. So I want to make the horse somewhere in that. I've considered, do I want to use an attunement slot? I didn't want to do that because it's thematically it doesn't fit. Although that could be a nice balancing feature. Um, I have thought about it. Do we take an attunement slot from it as a balance feature? But that's still sort of on my mind. Anyway, if you have thoughts about that, is this overbalancing it? Is it adding too much? Does it mess with the balance of or diminish some other character feature? I don't want to do that. If you think it does, let me know. Think of if you have a rebalance suggestion, let me know. Dairy dice roller mounted combat isn't something that I haven't dealt with yet, so this is really interesting stuff. Yeah, thanks. Most people haven't. I think it's because there's no way to handle it in D&D, so people aren't really thinking about it. I can say in previous editions of D&D, horse riding was very common. It was people always wanted a horse. Now the only reason to have a mount is to carry stuff, right? But mounted combat is a thing. So anyway, I'll post this week. It might be next week because I'm afraid of posting it before the session and the players realize, oh, I've got mounted combat coming my way. I'll probably post it this week. This will probably be my post for this week. So maybe a Wednesday or something like that. So I'll clean it up. I'll post these house rules and see what you guys think of it. All right. That's going to be my show for this week. I want to thank you if you're joining me. First time, many times, whatever. I hope you leave, like, subscribe, all of those things. I really, really appreciate you joining the show. I hope you'll engage me on Twitter with anything you thought was useful. I hope you'll comment on this on my blog, read the blog posts that come out, all those social media things. I'm a little discombobulated. I had a rough week. But thank you very much for joining me again. I hope it's really great having you. I do these shows every week at noon on Saturday. I'll be back next Saturday with a new show. We'll talk about something else then. I don't know what. If you have a topic you'd like to talk about, go ahead and drop that in Twitch or Twitter or wherever. You can leave comments. That'd be great. So thank you very much for joining me here today. I'm going to start the music to play me out. Start music. All right. Thanks everybody for joining me. Remember, in the meantime, fun is not optional. Thank you, everybody. Take care. You have a great day.
I feel